Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and we are fresh off of the Illumination Conference that just took place in Nashville. And it was an incredible time. It was a tremendous, I think I prayed for 600 people individually on Saturday night. For 2.5 hours. I was just drenched with sweat, but the Lord was there the whole time. It was an incredible time. And now, as with all things, Ken is in an airport, and we're trying to squeeze this in before he heads to the Netherlands for another round of ministry and missions and team leading. And so, Ken, thanks for making time. I know you're in a strange booth at a Sky Lounge or something like that, trying to squeeze this in, but as we say, it kind of is what it is. And I think we're all happy just to get a little bit of your insight and wisdom, even if we have to do it through means of this way. So I appreciate you bumping your schedule and taking time to be with us, because it's you have a pretty grueling schedule. And so fitting this in is not something that's very easy always. But I thought we could talk. It's just you and I. And I thought we could talk about the developments that have just taken place as we sit here. It's October 14th. We're recording this, 2025. The hostages have just been released from in Israel. The Israeli hostages. There's a peace deal. I read an article just a moment ago where J.D. Vance was quoted as saying we seem to be on the brink of sustainable peace in this region of the world, which was a pretty bold statement, but he's a bold guy, as we all know. And I just thought we could talk about that, and then we could piggyback a little bit onto some of the questions that I fielded at Illusion, or not Illusion, at Illumination. From Illusion, that's next year. Illusions. From Illumination, after Avner talked, I believe his first talk was primarily about the idea of replacement theology and how that's not a great thing. And so I had a lot of questions pop up from folks that would just pull me aside and ask me, what do I think about this? And so I said, well, let me just talk to the resident scholar here and get your answer, because all I've got is opinions, and that's not necessarily a great thing. So Ken, just kicking it off as we sit here today, I think we even said, was it the first conference that was around October 7th? Or was that last year's conference? But
I'd have to look at the calendar, Grant. I can do that, but I don't know if the Fusion Conference, which was Conference 1, actually did coincide with October 7 or not. So let me go back and look.
I think while you're looking, the reason I brought that up is because while you're looking is because it has seemed to be in the water the past few, these are the three global conferences for Orbis Ministries. And so it's been in the water here. And you mentioned it on the stage. Yes. Well, I say yesterday, my brain is pretty mush as well. Whenever you said it, but basically you mentioned how it was the October 7th happened during or right around the last conference right before. And so I just couldn't remember if it was the first conference or the second conference, but either way, it has been kind of a thematic picture of what's been going on, as we've had people like Avner Bosky coming in to talk about it at the same time. Israel is experiencing a tremendous amount of turmoil. And we just now have the hostages released and some kind of a peace deal. And I just wanted to hear your opinions and thoughts on that. And is it too much to read any sort of spiritual significance into that? Is it too much to think in more of a prophetic space? Or do we just say that it is what it is and those people are always going after each other? What do we think?
Well, let's go back to dates. First of all, October 7th, 2023 was the date of what the Palestinians call the Al-Aqsa flood. And that was a Saturday, and we held our Fusion Conference, which was the first of three, beginning on Wednesday, the 18th of October, so 11 days later.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that answers that question. and I apologize if there's an echo. I'm in one of these, booths that they have at airports, and it kind of is what it is. This is the best we could manage. So, and I know the lighting's not ideal. To my own eye, as I look at myself on the screen, I look like, I'm kind of red of face, and I'm not angry. I'm not hot. Just it's the lighting. Anyway, so for 2 years, there's been open war between Israel and Hamas, but not only Hamas. We've had Lebanon to the north, we've had Syria to the northeast, to a lesser extent, Iraq, or certain factions within Iraq. That's probably a better way to say it. There have even been some people within Jordan trying to create border incursions, but for the most part, the Jordanian authorities have been able to knock that down. And so I think, although it could have been significant, it in the end wasn't, in the scheme of things, it wasn't major. The Houthis to their southeast, and basically Israel's been surrounded, and there's plenty of information out there that shows, I wouldn't even say indicates, it shows beyond any doubt that this was orchestrated by Iran. Iran was fueling money and weapons to all of these various groups in these various countries that I've just named. And by the way, let's not forget the uprisings in the West Bank and in Samaria. And so, that's literally on the doorstep, just as Gaza is. And so all of this together has put immense pressure on Israel for the last couple of years. And on the one hand, it's a wonderful and amazing thing that these hostages that are still alive are coming home. Let's not forget, though, that even as this peace agreement appears to have been agreed upon, and note that I emphasize the word appears, Hamas said they would release all of the hostages, living and dead, within 72 hours of the signing of the agreement. They are already reneging on the provision for the deceased. They have released, I believe it was 4 bodies yesterday, and there were some more coming this morning. I didn't get the exact count, but they definitely have not released all of them. They say it's because they can't locate all of them. Well, do we believe Hamas about anything? So maybe that's right, but I think my bias would be it's probably not right. It's probably just a ruse, and it's a stalling tactic, and it's yet more attempting to retrade the deal, as we used to say on Wall Street. So I don't know. Is peace breaking out everywhere? I'll tell you what I think happened here. This is my considered opinion. I read a lot of news out of the Middle East. I read a limited amount of Arabic. I read Hebrew better than that, but I would come short of saying I'm fluent in either. But I talk to people, and I think Trump and Netanyahu, they realized that the weight of world opinion against this war was so heavy, and yet Netanyahu was not going to stop until the hostages were either known to be dead and their bodies were recovered, or they came home. That's it. And so, however they did it, by lining up some kind of I don't even know what to call it, an assemblage. That's probably as strong of a word as I want to use, of the Saudis, the Turks, some of the other countries in the Gulf, like Qatar. Qatar is the right way to say it, and some others, to lean on Hamas to release these hostages, which that has happened. But even as they have released the hostages, one of the provisions of this peace agreement is that they are supposed to lay down their weapons, disarm, and leave the Gaza Strip. And their senior leaders are saying openly now, and by the way, I don't think the world media is picking this up, but they are openly saying, we are not leaving the Gaza Strip. We are not surrendering our weapons. And so, to quote what the ancient Spartans once said to Artaxerxes, the Persian, if you want our weapons, come and get them. And so this is a pause in the fighting. You might call it an interbellum if you wanted to use Latin.
Well,
But
I don't know if you saw even today there were reports out that they just carried out a public execution and
hundreds of people are being executed on the streets.
for any sort of idea of colluding with Israel
Correct.
as traitors.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
Yeah. They blindfold them, they bind their hands behind their back, they make them kneel down, and they shoot them in the back of the head. And I've seen some videos of these executions being carried out. They are en masse. Hundreds of people are being killed. So has Hamas changed anything really? It was expedient, and I don't know what leverage was applied to them. I don't know what was threatened. I don't know what was offered. I don't know any of that. But they got them to give up the hostages. But I don't believe that this is going to be a lasting peace. And it's not because I'm a warmonger. I know a fair amount about war because I've studied military history. But I don't believe this is going to be a lasting peace. I don't know if it's going to last a week, 6 months, a year. I don't know. But I just do not believe that Hamas has changed one bit. And I think in the end, we're going to see more fighting in the Gaza Strip. It is interesting, though, there was all this talk of genocide going on and Gazans being starved. And yet, if you look at the video that's now coming out of the Gaza Strip, there don't seem to be very many emaciated Gazans. So I think that was largely a propaganda ploy.
Yeah. So what do you think, if any? I mean, maybe it's reading too far into it. When we think about the prophetic timeline and the eschatological timeline, especially with it seems like people are crying peace, peace. Uh, what do we think about this? Is this just another mile marker, or is there any sort of significance that you're sensing when it comes to this? Obviously, I'm not trying to get you to predict the end of the world or anything like that, but just we do, and we've talked multiple times about trying to discern where we are in the time frame.
Well, there are some things that are immovable markers in Scripture. So you either have to reject the Scripture, and these days many people do on many other topics. So why would prophecy be any different? But if you take the Scripture for what it says, Ezekiel says that God will gather his people back to the land he promised them in the last days. And once he has gathered them, I'm elaborating here. This isn't a verbatim quote, but I'm trying to be very clear so that our listeners will understand. Once he has gathered them in the land, then he will put his spirit upon them. So the first necessary step is the ingathering of the Jews back to the promised land. And that's been going on now for, well, since 1948. But really, it's accelerated dramatically in the last roughly 15 or 20 years. And so that seems to be well underway. We know that Paul, the apostle, says in Romans, it is not as though the promises of God had failed. Not everyone who's born a Jew is actually a Jew in heart, but he goes on to say that the remnant of Israel will be saved. And so there is a pending turning to Messiah, to Jesus, Yeshua. There is a pending turning to him, which has not yet happened. It'll probably coincide with this business of the Spirit being put upon the people of God. But if you read with, I would say, unvarnished eyes, the promises made in Genesis 12, and if you read what Paul has written in Romans, and there are some other passages as well, but I'm picking like the really big endpoints here. It is hard to come to the conclusion that God is finished with the Jews, and yet that seems to be an anchor point of much of modern theological thought, and it's true both Catholic and Protestant. If you go to Israel today, if you're driving on the main highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, as you go down out of Jerusalem toward Tel Aviv, over to the right, again, you're headed Jerusalem toward Tel Aviv, so you're headed west. over to the right, so to the north of the highway, there's a very large statue of Mary with her foot on the scroll of the Torah. Now, that could be interpreted to mean that, Mary is standing on the foundation of the Torah, but that's not what it means. And it's very clear if you look at it carefully and also study the history of that sculpture as well as the teaching of the Catholic Church. Mary is standing on the Torah because the Torah is being trampled underfoot. And particularly within Reformed strains of theology, but listen, Luther is as guilty as they come too. I mean, he's the great reformer, and yet he speaks very disparagingly of the Jews and talks about how they need to be killed and run out of town and so on and so on. So most of the magisterial Reformation, Lutheran, Calvinist, even maybe some of the Anabaptist strains, most of them are not very kind towards Jewish people.
Well, and I'll tell you, if you go back further, because I did a little research into this, into the Christian calendar, so to speak, and that was essentially, it's pretty openly stated that one of the reasons they wanted to do that is to break away from the Jews and to kind of create their own Christianized version of essentially God's calendar that He began. And it makes you wonder. We talk about roots and roots that are redeemable and roots that are not redeemable. And it really does kind of make you wonder, because that began this switch that was carried throughout basically after about 300. We see this move.
It's clearer than that. If you look at the writings of Justin Martyr,
right,
and some of the other fathers of that period, second century fathers, what you really see is the Gentilization. That's not a word you would commonly think of, but Gentiles are coming into the church, and the church becomes less and less Jewish in its orientation and more Gentiles, surely by force of numbers.
Mm.
It's like the Islamization of Europe that we're seeing right now going on in France and the UK and Spain, and, well, to a lesser extent, maybe Germany and so forth. But numbers talk. And so as more and more Gentiles come into the church, the theology, the language of the Christian faith becomes more and more Gentilized. And with that, there is a pushing aside of the story of Abraham and the Jews. Now, it's still there in the background. You can't really read the New Testament well without understanding the Old Testament story. But what happens is the church fathers, the preachers of the second and third century, they begin interpreting all of the promises to Israel as spiritual promises, and they love to grab a hold of the phrasing that the church is the Israel of God. And so with this, replacement theology comes to the fore, that the church has superseded Israel. But actually, if you read Romans carefully, you will see Paul states that the gathering in of the Gentiles is designed to incite in the Jews jealousy that they would return to their own Messiah by seeing that God has welcomed the Gentiles into the household of God. And this is really what Paul says in Ephesians. The great mystery of faith is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs. And this was something that in the Jewish mind just could not be conceived of. And yet this was in the mind of God. And so in the stories that we find in the book of Acts, it's a shocking thing when the Holy Spirit is poured out on Cornelius and the Roman cohort. These are Gentiles. Philip goes to Samaria. The Samaritans turn to the faith and to the Jewish Messiah. So they send Peter and John, and the Holy Spirit falls on them. We have the story in Acts 19 of Paul going to Ephesus, and there's a great revival in Ephesus, which is it's a Gentile city. And let's not forget Corinth, which is also a heavily Gentile Greek city. And there is an ingathering within the Corinthian context, takes 18 months that Paul is there. So the Bible doesn't actually say that the Gentile church was designed to or intended to replace Israel, but rather, as Paul says, are unambiguously in Romans, that the Gentiles would be grafted into Israel like wild olive branches grafted into the native olive tree. And so I like to say, if you're a Gentile, which means anything other than a born Jew, and you have come to faith, whether you know it or not, you actually are a Jew. Now, you're not a Jew by blood and birth, that's clear, but you have been grafted into the Jewish tree. And so, to extend the metaphor, would a branch try to chop down the tree that supplies it with the nutrients and life that allows it to, bear fruit on the vine? And think of an olive tree with, olives hanging from the branch. Well, no, it wouldn't. And of course, it is an extended metaphor. No branch could wield an axe or a saw and cut down its own trunk. But that's the idea that, whether you're Armenian, whether you're English, whether you're I don't know, Aztec or Incan or Mayan, whether you are a native born Zairian, or you're from Mozambique and your bloodline runs back thousands of years in those regions, or India, if you are a believer, you actually have been grafted into Judaism. That's the clear, unambiguous teaching of Paul the Apostle. And this is why you see so many of the, particularly evangelical and charismatic leaders in the church, siding with Israel in this time, because in so many words, what they're saying is not that Israel is always right in what it does, because we have plenty of evidence from the scriptural testimony that there are many times Israel was far off the track, and yet they remained God's people. And so what all of these leaders are saying is, look, these Jews, they are our brothers and sisters, because there is neither Jew nor Greek, is the way Paul puts it in the book of Galatians. So all of us have been drawn together into the one family of God. It's just that Jews in general continue to call him typically Hashem, which means the name, and the name being Yahweh. And Jesus taught us to call Yahweh Father.
Right. So that brings me to some questions that I fielded at the conference in regards to how we see the geopolitical state of Israel. And I've heard these questions pretty recently from a lot of different people. And the question is, okay, is the nation state of Israel the same thing as the people of Israel? Is the government of Israel the same thing as supporting Israel? Like, can we disagree with governmental functions and actions, or do we have to just give them a full pass? Like, how does it work? And so I think there's some confusion because we don't live in a really good place of nuance. We're not great at nuance as a people right now. And
Right.
it's just two extremes that I think people are hearing, is that either Israel is all good or all bad. Honestly, it seems to be the two extremes. And so I think a lot of thoughtful people are asking questions about how do we think about what we now call Israel, and does that count? So what do you say to those questions?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer to that is there's a lot of opinions out there. And even within the nation state of Israel, there are factions, some of whom, ardently believe that Israel should embrace the Palestinians and the Arabs around them. Although, in the wake of October 7, 2023, many, many, many of those people who would have been of the, why can't we all be friends, love, peace, and brown rice, they've really backed away from that. Many, not all. Because they realized that the barbarity of what happened on October 7, and I might even add to that, although I know this is going to be controversial and probably get some hate mail. What appears to have been widespread buy-in to all of that by the so-called innocent Gazans, the non-combatants who were, back at home on the other side of the fence. Many of them were cheering and celebrating as the atrocities of mass rape and burning of children and beheading people were being broadcast out on social media. And then when the hostages were brought into Gaza, crowds were gathering around cheering and jeering and so forth. It appears that there was widespread buy-in. I'm sure there are some innocent Gazans, but I would say many of them were complicit and, in fact, supportive of exactly what Hamas did. And there's plenty of video and audio evidence, as well as written evidence to support what I just said. It's not very widely broadcast in the West, but if you do your homework and look around, there is evidence that can be found. Israel, the people, are what God is most concerned about. But here's the problem. Israel, the people, began returning in 1948 in fulfillment of a promise that God would bring his people back to their land. And the day that Israel came into being as a nation state, multiple nations on multiple sides, back then it included Egypt, as well as Jordan, as well as Syria, they declared war on Israel the day it was born. And so Israel was born into war. Now, why is that? Well, because there is a strain of Islamic law. It's not found in the Quran, it's not found in the Hadith, but it's found in kind of the mainstream of Islamic law that says, I'm summarizing here, but what it says is, if a piece of territory has ever been under the control of the caliphate and has been part of the Waqf, W-A-Q-F, it's ever been part of that, then it is always and forever Islamic ground.
Mm.
And while there is ample evidence that the land of Israel was Jewish prior to, I'll just say, the fall of Rome, we can go through the Assyrian time and the Babylonian time, but Rome kind of ended Israel as a nation with the Jewish War. In 70 AD, it went on for a couple of years. And then the Jews were scattered everywhere. There were very few who remained in the land, but they were unprotected. There was no Jewish state. And that was the state of existence until 1948. Well, in 638 AD, so I'm just rounding this off, but more or less 550 years after Jerusalem falls to the Romans, so half a millennium and a bit more, all of that area is conquered by the armies of Islam. This is shortly after the death of Muhammad, and the caliphate is established in the Holy Land. And it's for that reason right there that I just described, 638 AD. And you can fact check this. Go look it up on the internet, anyone who's listening to me. That area became Islamic and continued to be so until the Crusades. And for a period of time, the Holy Land came under the control of Christian armies out of Western Europe. But ultimately, the Crusades ended and all of it reverted to Islamic control right up until the end of the First World War, when the British mandate over that whole region, and it included Syria and Iraq and other nations, but certainly included what was then known as Palestine. And by the way, that term is given to us by one of the Roman emperors who wanted to punish the Jews for their evil and their perfidy and their uprisings against Rome. And so he called it Aelia Capitolina, and then later on Palestina. This was all to shame and humiliate the Jews. And that's where we get the term Palestine and Palestinian. So by patrimony, the land was Jewish, but once it came under the control of the Islamic Caliph, it was deemed to be Islamic lands. And so that state of nature existed from 638 to 1917 with a kind of a 200-year mess known as the Crusades. And there's a whole story behind the Crusades, but we can't go into that right now. So that comprises roughly 1,300 years. And the British divide the land, and then ultimately, due to the Balfour Declaration in 1948, the Jewish state comes into existence. Now, it's interesting that the Jewish state was recognized by all of the major powers in the world. In fact, the US and the Soviet Union recognized Israel on the same day. And that in itself is extraordinary, because in those years, the US and the USSR were not good friends. But anyway, the British and the French and everybody, they all said, yes, this is real, this is valid. And that begins what the Palestinian people, the Palestinians aren't the same as the Arabs. To the West, we often just say the Arabs. But anyway, all of those other nation states, people groups in that area, that becomes the beginning of what they call in Arabic the Nakba, the disaster. And so there has been a state of perpetual war from 1948, the founding of Israel, right up to the present. And Hamas, they hold to that. And they say very clearly in their charter, again, go check this online, go look it up, look up the Hamas charter in English. They say our purpose is to destroy Israel. They are not to exist. This is Islamic land, and we will make war till our last drop of blood and our last body against Israel. So this is why I don't believe this so-called peace process is going to hold, because Hamas has not changed their story. And believe me, there are plenty of other people around the Middle East who hold essentially the same point of view. They just may not literally be part of this political organization known as Hamas.
Right. So then how do we as Christian thinkers, how do we think in light of, John 3:16, that he loved the whole world, right? And he sent his son, and that we're not supposed to have, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, principalities, of this age. How do we think in terms of when we're seeing, both of the atrocities are happening, and you can make a case for why on both sides or whatever, about whatever, but how do we feel and think about if we see, sure, okay, let's say Hamas did something bad, absolutely, but then we see some kind of retaliation or some kind of thought against them. There seems to be a lot of confusion in how that we think about that as Christians, and as people that want to stand with Israel, but that do see, things from their government, things from, their secret intelligence, all of that. How do we feel about that? How do we think about that? Can you help us to kind of digest that?
Yeah. So this kind of threads into your question about the Jewish state versus the Jewish people. The Jewish state is actually a pluralistic state. There are Muslims, there are the Druze who live within the boundaries of Israel. Christians live in Israel. They're not allowed to immigrate unless they can prove their Jewish roots, and even then it's difficult. Once you become a Christian, they kind of take a different view. But anyway, the state of Israel does not persecute Christian churches or denominations, and most of the denominations exist there, albeit in perhaps small numbers. But fundamentally, what the Jewish state is seeking to do is to make sure that there is a homeland for the Jews. And you have to remember that the reason there was a push for what is called Zionism is because there had been so much, well, the Holocaust was like the pinnacle of it, but there had been centuries and centuries and centuries of pogroms, of systematized persecution of the Jews in various countries, Germany, France, England. The Jews were expelled from Spain and from England in the Middle Ages and forced to surrender all their property. And they had nowhere to go, but this is where we get the term wandering Jew. We know from the Bible that Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. So this sort of thing had been going on for some time immemorial. And so the function of the Jewish government, the Jewish state at this time, is to be sure that the Jews have a homeland. And so while I don't think the state is synonymous with the people, and there are various points of view of how this should be, managed within Israel itself, and I'd say more broadly within the world community, you have to ask the question, if the state of Israel, if the government of Israel doesn't try to protect a place for Jews to live, who's going to do that?
Right.
It's kind of like when I say, if the church doesn't preach the gospel, who's going to do it? Are the Muslims going to do it? No. Are the Hindus going to do it? No. Are the atheists going to do it? No. Are the Buddhists going to do it? No. What about the animists? No. What about the Wiccans? No. The Christians have to preach the gospel. Well, if there's going to be a place for the Jews to go, and if God really did promise the land to Abraham in perpetuity, albeit with some long absences due to their own evil and wickedness and backsliding, then who is going to represent them? It's going to be the Jewish state and its government, albeit sometimes in ways that might be unpalatable to outsiders. It's not to say that every single thing the Jewish state does is correct or right, but this is the way the world works. I mean, does everything the US government do, is it right? And I don't care if you can take shots at Trump, but let's go back to Biden and Obama, or, before that, George W. Bush and then Clinton. We can just, no government is perfect. So this is really why the Jewish state came into being, and it's why you're going to see this kind of strong resistance to the kind of violence that has been waged against it repeatedly. We don't just have to talk about 1948. There's the 67 war, there's the 73 war, there's the Lebanon War of 1982. There have been several of the Intifada uprisings, two of them official and kind of an ongoing drumbeat of it in the background. All of this is kind of one continuous effort to bring down this entity, which again violates this tenet of Islamic law, that the land ought to be under Islamic control. But if it were, and Charlie Kirk famously said this, but he's not the first one to say it, trust me. He just maybe had a bigger platform and said it more forcefully. If Israel ceased to defend itself, it would cease to exist. Whereas if Hamas laid down its weapons, Hezbollah laid down its weapons, if all the Houthis, so on, Israel would not attack them. And if you need proof of that, look at the relationship Israel has maintained between itself and Egypt, with whom it has had a peace treaty since 1975, and Jordan, with whom it has had a peace treaty since slightly after, I can't remember the exact year, but anyway, the early 80s. So Israel doesn't attack those countries. It doesn't do anything. There's no border incursions. There's no slaughter of innocents. There's no bombing raids. There's nothing like that. So what you are seeing when you see all of this violence is there's an attack against Israel, and they have to take out those who are trying to kill their people. This is what goes on in war. War is a blunt instrument, and it is ugly. And it is in our living rooms and in our faces now. It's in our hand because we can watch it on our cell phones through streamed social media, and so it inflames our passions. But Israel is not waging offensive war here. After October 7, Hamas's leaders said there will be an October 8th and 9th and 10th. We will do this again and again and again. Well, they'd already shown they would do it once. Why would you doubt them? And that's really what triggered the Gaza war, and why Israel went into Gaza trying to destroy these people who were intent on destroying them.
That's good. So let me ask one last question here to help us think through it.
Yeah, that's good, because I got to run to my plane.
Yep. So let's see if we can answer it quickly. I'm American, you're American. Coming from an American perspective, and I recognize that we have a tremendous amount of people that listen to this that aren't American, so I apologize. There has been a tremendous amount of questions, and I got some of these questions as well at the conference about how do we think about our government. And you have a lot of people with the American first agenda sort of idea, But then also feeling as though we're doing a tremendous amount of maybe non-American first when it comes to Israel. And are we just supposed to go forward with that? Is that something that if we were to stop doing that, does that mean that we don't support Israel? Like, how do we think about that? I know that's been some questions that I've had asked of me recently.
Well, I don't think there's a good clean answer is the answer. On the one hand, America first means America first. On the other hand, Israel is the only democracy in that part of the world. And in many ways, I don't think it was established for this reason, just to be clear, but it functions as a, I don't know, bulwark against Islamic adventurism.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say it serves the purposes of the West collectively, not just America. You know, a lot of these Western European governments that are openly advocating for a state of Palestine and so forth, secretly they thank Israel. Secretly they say, you know, if you weren't there, we're not sure what we would do. Now, the last major incursion into Europe militarily by any sort of a caliph or anything like that was in 1648 with the siege of Vienna. But there have been periodic skirmishes that have occurred around the Mediterranean. And you know, one of the battles that is not really discussed anymore in school, but I remember learning this in school, and yes, I fact checked it, and yes, it's real. In the year 732, so this is in what we generally call the Dark Ages, Charles Martel, who was a French leader, in Tours, France, so in the south of France, he stopped an Islamic invasion that was trying to come right up through the south of France to take Western Europe. And it's considered one of the most important battles in the history of the world. It's one of the 10 most significant battles in history. We don't teach it anymore because it's deemed to be, you know, not appropriate. But both the Battle of Tours in 732 and the Battle of Vienna in 1648 are evidence, and there are other battles in between those two endpoints. I'm just using those two right now. Are evidence that if the caliphate had its way, all of Europe would be Islamic. And some would say, well, I don't care. Okay, maybe not. But if you look at Islamic society and you look at even modern Western society, which is highly secularized, but which still stands upon the foundations of Christian thought, and things like modern jurisprudence and fairness and women's rights, and so, I mean, just so many things like that. These are not generally found in Islamic society. Some are more tolerant, and you do find some of it there, but in general, no. And so you really have to ask, what civilization do you want to be in?
That's right. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. Well, I think it helps us as I mean, oftentimes we say on here that we're really trying to help Christians think biblically and interpret, you know, everything around us through those lenses. So I think this is a really hot topic. It's something that people are working through right now. There's divides within divides of all of these. How do we think about it? And so I think it's just helpful to kind of get the pullback perspective of, you know, looking at the history as a whole and where we are in that timeline. So
let me just say one last thing here, and this isn't, well, it pertains to Israel, but it's not specifically about Israel. The last thing I want to say is, don't forget that whether you call him Yeshua, Hamashiach, or Jesus the Christ, he's coming back. And this is an unambiguous teaching of the Christian scriptures. It also exists in the Jewish scriptures. They just think it'll be his first coming, and we're going to say it's his second coming. But he is coming back. And a lot of this turmoil that you're seeing is an inescapable lead up to his return. And so the fact that the Middle East is heating up, or has heated up, and we may go into a bit of a cool down period here for a bit, but sooner or later it's going to erupt again. all of these are the necessary signs that lead up to Jesus' return. And some might say, well, why is it necessary? Because Jesus said it was necessary. He said there would be wars and rumors of wars, and the end is not yet, but then you will see his sign in the heavens. And so we don't like war. We shouldn't like war. We're sick if we like war. And in fact, the Hebrew prophets say nation will not learn to make war against nation anymore. The lion will lie down with the lamb. That is what we all want in the long run. But we have to go through this process that leads to the return of Christ. And these things, I haven't really unpacked it here because we don't have time. Maybe it's another podcast for another time. But these things are collectively part of what will usher in the return of Jesus.
Yeah, that's great. And it does say specifically, you know where he returns? In Israel.
That's right. In fact, he's going to establish his messianic kingdom on the Temple Mount, right over where the Holy of Holies lies buried, which happens very inconveniently to be the site of the Al-Aqsa complex.
Right.
So we are not going to get out of this thing easily. And don't forget that Zechariah 12:3 states that in the last days, Jerusalem will be a stumbling block to all nations.
Mm-hmm.
And those who trip over it will find themselves crushed.
Mm.
So it pays to understand the issues, the gravity of the times, and why these things really matter.
Yeah. Good.
All right,
Good.
I catch a plane.
All right, Ken, thanks so much for taking time to help us understand the complexities of the turmoil in the Middle East in 30 minutes. So I think we did it. We solved all of those questions. And thank you all for listening. We'll be back here next week with another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish.
If you are blessed by the content on this podcast, please pay it forward and click on the donation link in the description of this episode. To support Ken directly, you can select the Ken Fish Support Fund. Or, if you would like to give to support the rest of the team, select the General Fund. Thank you so much for your consideration. We are deeply grateful to all of our financial partners.